In the dusty archives of the British Museum, among thousands of cuneiform tablets recovered from the ancient ruins of Nippur and Ur, lies one of humanity's oldest and most haunting visions of death. The descent of Inanna, inscribed in Sumerian around 2100 BC, but preserving traditions reaching back at least another millennium, describes not a paradise of reward nor a hell of punishment, but something far more unsettling. Irkalla, the land of no return, where all the dead, regardless of earthly status or moral conduct, descended into eternal darkness beneath the earth. Unlike the elaborate Egyptian afterlife with its scales of judgment and fields of reeds, or the later Greek Elysium reserved for heroes, the Sumerian vision presented death as the great equalizer, a realm where kings and slaves alike became shadows dwelling in dust, their only sustenance clay and brackish water. Their only light the dim glow of ghostly fires that never warmed. What makes the Sumerian conception of the afterlife particularly significant for understanding ancient Near Eastern thought is its remarkable consistency across multiple independent sources spanning over a millennium. The same bleak vision appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in incantation texts designed to protect the living from vengeful ghosts, in royal funerary inscriptions, and in administrative documents detailing offerings made to the dead. This consistency suggests that the Sumerian afterlife beliefs were not merely literary devices or priestly inventions, but represented deeply held cultural convictions about the nature of death and the fate awaiting all humanity. The evidence we're about to examine draws from archaeological excavations of royal tombs, cuneiform medical and magical texts, ritual procedures preserved in temple archives, and mythological narratives that reveal a civilization profoundly shaped by its relationship with death and the boundary between the living and the dead. The Sumerian underworld was not conceived as an abstract spiritual realm, but as a specific physical location beneath the surface of the earth, accessible through gates and passages that connected it to the world of the living. Cuneiform texts describe Irkalla as existing in the literal depths below Mesopotamia, a vast cavern system beneath the freshwater ocean called the Abzu, which the Sumerians believed lay under the Earth's surface. The most detailed topographical description appears in the Descent of Inanna, preserved on tablets from the Old Babylonian period but clearly based on much earlier Sumerian traditions, which describes the goddess's journey through 7 gates as she descends deeper into the realm of the dead. The physical geography of this underworld realm was described with remarkable consistency across multiple independent sources spanning over a millennium of Sumerian civilization. Administrative tablets from the early dynastic period, approximately 2600 BC, reference the Kur, meaning mountain or netherworld, as a physical location beneath the earth where the dead resided in eternal darkness. The term itself reveals Sumerian conceptual frameworks, as Kur originally denoted the foreign mountainous lands to the east and north of Mesopotamia, suggesting that the underworld was imagined as a distant, inaccessible region beneath the familiar landscape of the river valleys. The architectural features of Irkalla mirrored those of Sumerian cities above ground, with temples, palaces, and residential districts, but all constructed of dust and shadow rather than mud, brick and stone. Tablet Ni 4350 from the University of Pennsylvania excavations at Nippur describes the palace of Ereshkigal as containing multiple courts and chambers where the Anunnaki Judges sat, and where newly arrived souls received their assignments. The text indicates that distances within the underworld were measured in the same units used for earthly geography. The Beru or double hour of walking suggesting that the Sumerians conceived of Irkalla as having definable dimensions and measurable extent rather than existing as a formless void. The location of the entrance to the underworld changed depending on the mythological context, but certain geographical features were consistently associated with access to the realm of the dead. The city of Kutha, located approximately 80 kilometers northeast of Babylon, was considered particularly sacred to the underworld deities, and its main temple, the Meslam, served as a primary point of contact between the living world and Irkalla. Excavations at Kuthar, conducted by Hormuzd Rassam between 1879 and 1882, uncovered temple foundations and ritual deposits that confirm the site's association with death worship, including thousands of clay figurines depicting underworld demons and protective spirits. Mountain caves, deep wells, and the mouths of the two great rivers were also understood as potential doorways to the land below. The Tigris and Euphrates, which brought life-giving water to Mesopotamian agriculture, were simultaneously conceived as flowing from and returning to the Abzu, the cosmic freshwater ocean beneath the earth, where these rivers disappeared into marshlands or sank into the ground during dry seasons. The Sumerians perceived direct connections to the underworld. Tablet CBS 10670 from Nippur preserves an incantation describing how the waters of the rivers flow down to Irkalla, carrying offerings and libations from the living to the dead below. The vertical structure of the cosmos in Sumerian thought placed the heavens above, the earth in the middle, and Irkalla below, creating a three-tiered universe with clear boundaries and connections between each level. Tablet V AT 7835 from the Vorderasiatisches Museum describes how the sky god and ruled the heavens, Enlil governed the earth and atmosphere, and Ereshkigal held dominion over everything beneath the surface. This vertical ordering meant that descent to the underworld involved literal downward movement through the earth's crust, through the waters of the Abzu, and finally into the dark caverns where the dead dwelt. The journey to the land of the dead required passage through 7 consecutive gates, each guarded by a gatekeeper who demanded the removal of divine power and earthly status. Tablet UM 2915. 883 from the University of Pennsylvania collection preserves the most complete account of these barriers, describing how Inanna, Queen of Heaven, was progressively stripped of her regalia and authority as she descended. At the first gate, the lapis lazuli measuring rod and line were removed, symbols of her dominion over heaven and earth. At the second gate, the small lapis beads around her neck were taken, representing her connection to celestial powers. The systematic stripping of Inanna's divine attributes continued at each successive gate, with the third gate demanding her double strand of beads, the fourth gate requiring her breastplate, the fifth gate taking her gold ring, the sixth gate removing her lapis lazuli measuring rod, and the seventh and final gate demanding her royal robe. By the time she reached Ereshkigal's throne room at the deepest point of Irkalla, Inanna stood naked and powerless, reduced from Queen of Heaven to a vulnerable supplicant before her sister. This progressive diminishment served multiple symbolic functions within the narrative, representing the stripping away of earthly identity and divine authority that all beings, mortal or immortal, must undergo when entering the land of the dead. The number 7 held profound significance in Mesopotamian religious thought, appearing repeatedly in contexts associated with completion, cosmic order, and divine power. The 7 gates of the underworld corresponded to other sets of 7 in Sumerian cosmology, including the 7 Anunnaki Judges who determined the fates of the dead, the 7 divine decrees that governed cosmic order, and the 7 tablets of destiny that recorded all events past, present, and future. Mathematical texts from the Old Babylonian period demonstrate that Sumerian scholars recognize 7 as the first prime number beyond 3 and 5, lending it special mathematical and mystical properties. Archaeological evidence for the ritual significance of 7-stage descent appears in the architectural layouts of certain Mesopotamian temples and ziggurat complexes. The ziggurat of excavated by Sir Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934, originally stood with 7 distinct levels, each painted a different colour and representing different cosmic domains. While the ziggurat served as a stairway for gods to descend from heaven to earth, its 7-stage structure inversely mirrored the 7 gates that souls descended through when travelling from earth to the underworld. This architectural symmetry reflected the Sumerian understanding of the cosmos, as ordered through numerical patterns and corresponding structures above and below the Earth's surface. The gatekeepers who controlled passage through these 7 barriers held positions of considerable power within the underworld hierarchy, second only to Ereshkigal herself in their authority over who entered and under what conditions. Tablet K 6174 from the British Museum identifies the chief gatekeeper as Netti, whose interrogation of Inanna established the protocols that all souls, divine or mortal, must follow when approaching the gates of death. Netti's questions to Inanna addressed her identity, her purpose in coming to the underworld, and her authority to demand entrance, demonstrating that entry to Irkalla required justification and permission rather than occurring automatically upon death. The physical construction of these gates, as described in ritual texts, involved massive doors of cedar wood reinforced with bronze, set into stone jambs carved with protective incantations. Tablet CBS 14429 from Nippur preserves portions of an incantation designed to bind these gates shut against the escape of the dead, describing 7 locks on each gate, each lock requiring a separate key held by different divine officials. The multiplication of 7 gates by 7 locks created 49 barriers between the living world and the realm of the dead, a number significant as 7 squared, reinforcing through mathematical symbolism the absolute separation between the 2 domains. The goddess Ereshkigal, whose name translates as Lady of the Great Place, ruled the underworld from her palace at the deepest point of Irkalla, where she sat upon a throne surrounded by the Anunnaki, the 7 judges of the underworld. Unlike her sister Inanna, goddess of love and war who traversed between heaven and earth, Ereshkigal was forever confined to the realm of the dead, unable to ascend to the world above. Her character, as preserved in Sumerian literature, presents a figure of profound isolation and bitterness, a divine being imprisoned in darkness. Feeding on clay and drinking muddy water alongside the dead she governed. The relationship between Ereshkigal and Inanna reveals fundamental tensions within Sumerian divine hierarchies and cosmological structures. Multiple myths describe these sisters as embodying opposing principles, with Inanna representing fertility, sexuality, warfare, and the dynamic forces of life above ground, while Ereshkigal personified sterility, isolation, stillness, and the static permanence of death below. Their opposition was not merely symbolic but geographical and cosmological, with Inanna's temples dominating the urban landscapes of Uruk and other cities, while Ereshkigal's cult centres focused on boundary locations like Kutha, where the living world gave way to the realm of the dead. Tablet CBS 1966 from the University of Pennsylvania collection preserves a version of Ereshkigal's origin story, explaining how she came to rule the underworld. According to this account, when the cosmos was first divided among the gods following the creation of the world, the 3 realms of heaven, earth, and underworld were distributed to the 3 most powerful deities, and received the heavens. Enlil took the earth and atmosphere, and Ereshkigal, either by assignment or by necessity, descended to rule the realm beneath. Once she had taken up residence in Irkalla, the laws governing the underworld prevented her from ever returning to the world above, making her sovereignty over the dead simultaneously a position of great power and a form of eternal exile. The isolation of Ereshkigal's existence found expression in her perpetual hunger and thirst, conditions that affected all inhabitants of the underworld but seemed particularly tragic when imposed upon a divine being. Mythological texts describe how Ereshkigal, like the dead she ruled, consumed clay for bread and drank muddy water for beer, the standard Sumerian descriptions of underworld sustenance. This detail appears with remarkable consistency across multiple sources, including the Descent of Inanna, the Gilgamesh epic, and various incantation texts, suggesting it represented a fundamental belief about the nature of existence in Irkalla rather than a mere literary device. Her relationship with other gods was marked by both respect for her authority and reluctance to enter her domain. When divine messengers arrived from the world above carrying communications to Ereshkigal, elaborate protocols governed their interactions to ensure they would not be trapped in the underworld. Tablet K 3157 describes how the god Namtar, Ereshkigal's vizier, would ascend to receive messages at the upper gates, rather than requiring divine messengers to descend fully into Irkalla, protecting them from the laws that would prevent their return if they entered the realm of the dead completely. Ereshkigal's palace at the centre of Irkalla served as both royal residence and cosmic courtroom, where the Anunnaki judges determined the fates of newly arrived souls. Architectural descriptions preserved in ritual texts indicate the palace contained multiple courts and chambers arranged in hierarchical order, with the outer courts accessible to ordinary dead souls and the inner sanctum reserved for Ereshkigal's throne room, where only those specifically summoned could enter. The throne itself, described as constructed from lapis lazuli and carnelian, symbolized the absolute authority Ereshkigal wielded over all who entered her domain, divine or mortal, powerful or weak. The seven Anunnaki who sat in judgment in Ereshkigal's throne room represented a distinct class of deities whose primary function involved the administration of death in the underworld. Cuneiform texts from Nippur, particularly tablet CBS 29, 13, 44, describe these judges as fixing the fates of the newly dead, though their judgments did not involve moral evaluation of earthly conduct. Instead, the Anunnaki determined the precise location and condition of the deceased within Irkalla's hierarchy, assigning positions based on the funeral rites performed, offerings made by descendants, and the manner of death rather than ethical behaviour during life. The term Anunnaki literally means offspring of An, identifying these deities as children of the sky god, and therefore possessing divine lineage and authority. However, their specific association with the underworld and their role as judges of the dead distinguish them from other groups of divine beings in the Sumerian pantheon. Tablet Viat 9555 from Berlin preserves a liturgical text addressing the Anunnaki as those who sit in the place of judgment, who determine destinies, who fix the fates of the dead. The repetitive structure of this liturgy emphasizes their judicial function as central to their identity and purpose, unlike the later Egyptian concept of the weighing of the heart against the feather of Mat, which evaluated moral conduct and determined whether souls deserved reward or punishment. The Anunnaki judges made determinations based entirely on ritual and social factors. A king who had been buried with full ceremonial honours, accompanied by lavish grave goods and sustained by regular offerings from descendants, received favourable placement in Irkalla's hierarchy, regardless of whether his earthly reign had been just or tyrannical. Conversely, a morally upright commoner who died far from home and received no proper burial faced a miserable existence among the unquiet dead, haunting the boundaries between Irkalla and the living world. This ritual-based rather than ethics-based judgment system reflects fundamental aspects of Sumerian religious thought and social organisation. Tablet CBS 10691 from Nippur preserves a wisdom text explicitly stating that the gods care not for human morality, but for proper performance of rituals and maintenance of offerings. This theological position, which modern scholars have termed ritual orthopraxy rather than moral orthodoxy, meant that correct performance of ceremonies mattered far more than ethical behaviour in determining divine favour both during life and after death. The hierarchical structure within Irkalla mirrored the social organisation of Sumerian cities above ground, with the dead arranged in ranks corresponding to their earthly status and the quality of their funerary rites. Those who had been kings sat at tables and were served food and drink by lesser souls, while those who had been priests and priestesses conducted rituals in dusty temples beneath the earth. Warriors who had died in battle and received proper burial stood guard at the gates and courts of Ereshkigal's palace, while craftsmen continued their trades in shadow workshops. Producing goods from the substance of dust and darkness, archaeological evidence from the royal cemetery at Ur demonstrates the practical application of these beliefs in funerary practices designed to ensure favourable judgment by the Anunnaki. The tomb of Queen Puabi, excavated by Leonard Woolley in 1927, contained not only her body adorned with elaborate jewellery and ceremonial regalia, but also the remains of 74 attendants who apparently entered the tomb alive and consumed poison so they could serve their queen in the afterlife. The careful arrangement of these bodies, each positioned at their appointed station with their tools or musical instruments, reveals a belief that earthly hierarchies and occupations would continue in the underworld, at least for those of sufficient status to command such elaborate burial preparations. The timing of the Anunnaki judgment occurred immediately upon arrival in the underworld, with souls brought directly to Ereshkigal's throne room to receive their assignments. Tablet K 2843 from Ashurbanipal's library describes this process in procedural detail, indicating that each newly arrived soul was announced by Netti the Gatekeeper, interrogated about their identity and earthly status, and questioned regarding the funeral rites that had been performed for them. Based on this information, combined with reports from divine observers who had witnessed their death, the Anunnaki rendered their verdict, assigning the soul to its designated location within Irkalla's elaborate geography. Ereshkigal's chief minister was Namtar, whose name means fate or destiny, a demon who served as both her messenger to the world above and the personification of disease and death itself. Medical incantation texts from the Old Babylonian period, including those in the Yale Babylonian collection, identify Namtar as the source of 60 diseases that afflicted humanity, each representing a different manifestation of death's approach. Unlike the other inhabitants of Irkalla, Namtar possessed the ability to move freely between the underworld and the living world, carrying messages from Ereshkigal and selecting victims for death through the diseases he commanded. The number 60 held particular significance in Mesopotamian mathematics and cosmology as the base of their numerical system, the same sexagesimal framework that continues to structure our measurement of time and angles today. Namtar's association with exactly 60 diseases therefore represented completeness, the full spectrum of ways that death could manifest in the living world. Tablet YBC 4644 from the Yale Babylonian collection preserves a medical text listing these 60 diseases by name and symptom, ranging from fever and wasting sickness to paralysis and madness, each identified as one of Namtar's 60 demons sent to claim victims for Ereshkigal's realm. Namtar's physical appearance, as described in incantation texts designed to ward off his influence, presented a terrifying combination of human and bestial features. He possessed the body of a man but the head of a lion or bull, with wings that allowed him to travel swiftly between the upper and lower worlds. His hands ended in talons rather than fingers, and his breath carried the stench of death and decay. These descriptions served both symbolic and practical functions in Mesopotamian medical thought, personifying disease as a monstrous predator that stalked human victims and explaining the symptoms of illness as the physical manifestation of Namtar's touch. His role as messenger between Ereshkigal and the gods above placed Namtar in situations of considerable diplomatic sensitivity, as demonstrated in the myth of Nergal and Ereshkigal, preserved on tablets from the library of Ashurbanipal. When the gods gathered for a feast in heaven and sent portions to Ereshkigal in the underworld out of courtesy, she dispatched Namtar to receive the offerings on her behalf. The assembled gods rose to show respect when Namtar arrived, all except Nergal, god of war and plague, who remained seated in deliberate insult. Namtar reported this offence to Ereshkigal, leading to a series of confrontations that ultimately resulted in Nergal becoming Ereshkigal's consort and co-ruler of the underworld. The chief gatekeeper of the underworld, Netti, whose name means my trust or my strength, controlled access to Irkalla from the world of the living. Tablet K 3157 from the British Museum preserves detailed descriptions of Netti's duties, which included interrogating all who approached the gates of death, determining whether they came as visitors who might return or as permanent residents of the underworld. When Inanna descended to attend the funeral rites of Gugalanna, the Bull of Heaven, Netti questioned her extensively before reporting her arrival to Ereshkigal, demonstrating that even divine beings could not enter the land of the dead without proper authorization. Netti's interrogation of Inanna established the protocols that governed all entry to the underworld, creating a bureaucratic framework that applied equally to gods and mortals. When the goddess approached the first gate, Netti demanded to know her identity, asking why she had come to the land of no return and what authority granted her the right to demand entrance. Inanna's responses, preserved in tablet UM29 15 883, reveal the formal nature of this exchange, with the goddess identifying herself by her full titles and divine epithets, explaining her purpose as attending funeral rites, and invoking her status as Queen of Heaven as justification for entry. The gatekeeper's authority extended beyond simple interrogation to include the power to strip visitors of their divine attributes and earthly possessions as they passed through each successive gate. At Netti's command, enforced by subordinate gatekeepers stationed at the lower levels, Inanna surrendered her regalia piece by piece, diminishing from Queen of Heaven to naked supplicant by the time she reached Ereshkigal's throne room. This systematic disempowerment demonstrated that Netti served not merely as a passive guardian, but as an active enforcer of the underworld's absolute sovereignty over all who entered its domain. The physical location of Netti's station at the outermost gate of the underworld placed him at the crucial threshold between the living world and the realm of the dead, a liminal position that granted him unique powers and responsibilities. Unlike Ereshkigal, who remained trapped within Irkalla, or Namtar, who could move freely between worlds, Netti existed precisely at the boundary, belonging fully to neither domain. This positioned him as the ultimate arbiter of passage, the figure who determined which souls entered as permanent residents, and which might, under extraordinary circumstances, be permitted to return. Ritual texts from the old Babylonian period describe offerings made specifically to Netti at grave sites and tomb entrances, suggesting that families of the deceased sought to ensure favourable reception when their loved ones arrived at the gates of death. Tablet CBS 18,934 from Nippur preserves a prayer addressed to Netti, requesting that he grant swift passage through the gates and favourable report to Ereshkigal regarding the deceased's status and the quality of funeral rites performed. The specificity of these prayers indicates that Sumerians understood Netti's role as involving discretionary judgment, rather than automatic processing of arriving souls. The architectural symbolism of gates and doorways permeated Sumerian religious thought, with transitions between spaces carrying profound cosmological significance. Temples throughout Mesopotamia incorporated elaborate gateway structures that marked boundaries between the profane exterior and sacred interior. Between human and divine domains, the seven gates of the underworld represented the ultimate expression of this architectural theology, creating a graduated transition between the world of the living and the realm of the dead that required passage through multiple thresholds, each diminishing the traveller's connection to earthly existence. Archaeological evidence from burial sites reveals physical manifestations of this symbolic geography in tomb construction. Excavations at conducted by Leonard Woolley uncovered tomb complexes that incorporated multiple chambers and doorways, creating a series of nested spaces that deceased souls would need to traverse on their journey to the underworld. The tomb of King Mesopotamian, discovered in 1924, included an outer chamber where funeral offerings were deposited, a middle chamber containing the bodies of sacrificed attendants, and an inner sanctum where the king himself was interred, replicating in miniature the seven-stage descent through the gates of Irkalla. The gallu demons served as Ereshkigal's police force, dragging souls to the underworld and ensuring that none escaped once they had entered the land of no return. These creatures, described in multiple Sumerian texts as having no mother, father, wife, or child, existed solely to serve the purposes of death, immune to pleas or bribes. The most detailed account of their nature appears in the final tablets of the descent of Inanna, where 7 Galla accompanied the goddess back to the world of the living with orders to seize a substitute to take her place in the underworld permanently. The description of the Galla as beings without family or social connections emphasized their fundamental difference from both humans and the anthropomorphic gods of the Sumerian pantheon. Normal divine beings had genealogies, relationships, and emotional attachments that influenced their behavior and created possibilities for negotiation or appeal. The Galla, by contrast, existed outside these networks of kinship and obligation, making them incorruptible enforcers of underworld law who could not be swayed by tears, pleas, or offerings. Tablet CBS 14,414 from the Hilprecht collection explicitly states that the Galla know not food, know not drink, eat not scattered grain, drink not libated water, demonstrating their complete separation from the rituals and exchanges that governed relationships between humans and other divine beings. Their physical appearance, as preserved in incantation texts and artistic representations, combined humanoid form with bestial and demonic characteristics that marked them as creatures of the underworld. Cylinder seals from the early dynastic period, including examples housed in the Louvre and British Museum, depict the Galla with human bodies, animal heads, and wings or claws that identified them as supernatural beings. Some representations show them with scorpion tails or serpentine lower bodies, emphasizing their dangerous and inhuman nature. These visual characteristics serve to make the Galla immediately recognizable in artistic contexts and reinforce their role as creatures who existed to capture and drag souls to the underworld. The number 7 appears repeatedly in descriptions of Galla demon groups, with 7 Galla accompanying Inanna on her return from the underworld, 7 Galla pursuing Damuzi when he fled to avoid being taken as Inanna's substitute, and 7 Galla serving as Ereshkigal's primary enforcers in the realm of the dead. This numerical consistency connects the Galla to other sets of 7 in Sumerian cosmology, including the 7 gates of the underworld, the 7 Anunnaki Judges, and the 7 divine decrees. The repetition of this number suggests that Sumerian theological thought organized supernatural forces into heptadic groups that represented completeness and cosmic order. The Galla's primary function involved pursuing and capturing souls who attempted to escape their destined death, or who violated the laws governing passage between the living world and the underworld. When Damuzi fled from the Galla who sought to drag him to Irkalla as Inanna's substitute, Tablet HS 1414 describes how they pursued him relentlessly across the landscape, transforming him from human to gazelle form in desperate attempts to hide. The Galla tracked him to the house of his sister Inanna, where they tortured her to reveal his location, demonstrating their absolute determination to fulfill their mission regardless of obstacles or moral considerations. The immunity of the Galla to bribes, pleas and offerings that might sway other supernatural beings created a particular horror in Sumerian imagination. Medical and magical texts from all periods include incantations designed to protect against the Galla, suggesting widespread fear of these creatures who might be sent by Ereshkigal to claim victims before their destined time. Tablet K 2891 from Ashurbanipal's library preserves a protective ritual that involves creating a clay figure of a Galla demon, inscribing it with binding spells, and burying it at the threshold of a house to prevent actual Galla from crossing into the dwelling. The relationship between the Galla and human mortality involved more than simply dragging dead souls to the underworld. These demons also participated in the actual killing process, accompanying diseases sent by Namtar and assisting in the separation of souls from bodies at the moment of death. Incantation texts describe the Galla as seizing the breath, cutting the throat and binding the limbs of dying persons, creating vivid personifications of death's physical processes. This participation in both killing and soul capture made the gallu the most feared supernatural beings in Sumerian demonology, creatures who brought death itself rather than merely administering its consequences. Life in the Sumerian underworld bore little resemblance to existence among the living, reduced to a shadowy mockery of earthly experience where all pleasures and comforts were replaced by deprivation and gloom. Tablet H. S. 1491 from the Hilprecht collection describes the inhabitants of Irkalla as dwelling in darkness like birds, wearing feathers for garments, eating clay for bread, and drinking muddy water for beer. The architectural features of the underworld mirrored those of Sumerian cities above, with temples and palaces and ordinary dwellings, but all constructed of dust and inhabited by shadows rather than living flesh. The comparison of the dead to birds appears repeatedly across Sumerian literature describing the underworld, creating a consistent metaphor that conveyed both the insubstantial nature of ghosts and their confinement within the bounded space of Irkalla. Birds could move and fly within enclosed spaces but could not escape through solid walls. Just as the dead could move about within the underworld but could never pass back through the gates to the living world, the feathered garments mentioned in the text suggest that this transformation into bird-like creatures was understood as a literal physical change rather than a mere poetic comparison, with souls losing their human form and becoming winged shadows. The diet of clay and muddy water represented the ultimate inversion of Sumerian culinary culture, which celebrated bread made from barley and wheat, and beer brewed from grain and flavoured with dates. The offering formulas inscribed on tomb monuments consistently requested bread and beer for the dead, suggesting that families hoped to provide their deceased relatives with actual food and drink rather than the clay and mud that formed the natural sustenance of the underworld. The effectiveness of these offerings in improving conditions for the dead became a central concern of Sumerian funerary practice and ancestor veneration. The darkness of the underworld was not merely an absence of light, but an active substance that filled Irkalla, described in texts as thick dust that obscured vision and settled on everything like a blanket. Tablet CBS 10,670 from Nippur preserves a description of this darkness as something that could be tasted and felt, pervading the lungs and coating the skin of the dead. The only illumination came from dim fires that provided no warmth, creating a perpetual twilight that allowed minimal vision but offered no comfort or relief from the cold dampness that characterized the realm beneath the earth. The spatial organization of the underworld replicated Sumerian urban planning in shadow form, with streets and districts arranged according to the same principles that governed cities like Uruk and Nippur above ground. The dead occupied houses appropriate to their earthly status, with former kings dwelling in palaces, priests residing near temples, and common people inhabiting modest structures in residential quarters. This hierarchical arrangement meant that social distinctions persisted after death, though all inhabitants shared the same miserable conditions of darkness, dust, and sustenance of clay and mud. Temple complexes in the underworld served as sites for ongoing ritual activity, conducted by deceased priests and priestesses who continued their religious duties in shadow form. Tablet VAT 7835 describes these underworld temples as dark reflections of their earthly counterparts, with the same architectural layouts and ceremonial equipment, but constructed from dust and shadow rather than mud brick and cedar wood. The offerings made in these temples consisted of clay instead of bread, muddy water instead of beer, and the blood of shadow animals instead of the blood of actual livestock. The palace of Ereshkigal at the centre of Irkalla functioned as both royal residence and administrative headquarters for the underworld bureaucracy. The throne room where the Anunnaki Judges sat and where newly arrived souls received their assignments occupied the innermost chamber, accessible only through multiple courts and corridors that created graduated zones of access corresponding to status and authority. The architectural descriptions preserved in ritual texts indicate that distance from Ereshkigal's throne corresponded inversely with quality of afterlife existence, with those assigned positions near the throne enjoying marginally better conditions than those relegated to the outer regions of Irkalla. One of the most distinctive features of Sumerian afterlife belief was its fundamental egalitarianism regarding the fate of souls in Irkalla. Unlike Egyptian concepts where pharaohs could become gods, or Greek ideas of Elysian fields for heroes, Sumerian texts consistently present death as the great equalizer that reduced all humans to the same shadowy existence. The Epic of Gilgamesh, particularly in Tablet 7 where Enkidu dreams of the Underworld, describes how he saw kings who had ruled the earth now serving at tables in the House of Dust, and high priests and priestesses dwelling in darkness alongside common people. Enkidu's dream vision, occurring shortly before his death from divine curse, provides the most detailed mortal perspective on conditions in Irkalla preserved in Sumerian literature. Tablet 7 of the standard Babylonian version, compiled from earlier Sumerian sources, describes how Enkidu saw himself transformed into a creature with birds' wings and arms covered with feathers, led by a dark being through the house from which none who enter ever return. The path led downward through increasing darkness to the dwelling where earth is their food and clay their bread, where they see no light and dwell in darkness, wearing garments like birds. The vision emphasizes the inversion of earthly hierarchies through specific examples of role reversal. Kings, who had worn crowns, now served food and drink to others. High priests and priestesses who had performed sacred rites for the gods now received offerings of clay and water like common dead, and warriors who had commanded armies now stood guard at dusty gates with no enemies to fight. These reversals demonstrated that whatever power and status individuals had possessed during life counted for nothing in the underworld, where all were reduced to the same condition of shadowy diminishment. The egalitarian nature of the Sumerian afterlife stands in sharp contrast to the hierarchical structure of Sumerian society during life, where kings ruled through divine mandate, priests mediated between humans and gods, and strict social stratification determined access to resources and opportunities. The complete dissolution of these hierarchies in death suggests a profound ambivalence about earthly power structures, acknowledging their necessity during life while recognizing their ultimate meaninglessness in the face of mortality's universal levelling. This democratization of death created significant theological and social implications for Sumerian civilization. If neither moral virtue nor earthly achievement could secure a better afterlife, what motivated ethical behaviour or striving for accomplishment? The answer lay partly in the immediate rewards and punishments experienced during earthly life, where the gods were believed to grant prosperity to the righteous and afflict the wicked with disease and disaster. Additionally, the quality of one's burial and the faithfulness of descendants in providing offerings could marginally improve conditions in the underworld, creating incentives for establishing family wealth and maintaining ancestor veneration practices. While moral conduct during life had little impact on one's fate in the Sumerian underworld, the proper performance of burial rituals proved absolutely crucial for determining the quality of existence among the dead. Administrative tablets from documenting temple expenditures reveal the enormous resources devoted to funerary offerings and burial procedures, suggesting that Sumerian society viewed these rituals as essential rather than optional. Tablet UET 6391 describes the minimum requirements for proper burial, including washing and anointing the body, wrapping it in clean cloth, placing it in a sealed coffin with basic provisions, and conducting 7 days of ritual mourning with regular food and drink offerings. The washing and anointing of the corpse served both practical and ritual purposes, cleansing the body of the pollution of death while preparing it for presentation to the underworld deities. The substances used in this process carried symbolic significance, with water representing purification and oil symbolizing the restoration of life force that would enable the deceased to function as a conscious entity in Irkalla. archaeological evidence from burial sites reveals that bodies were typically washed with water drawn from sacred springs or rivers, then anointed with sesame or cedar oil mixed with aromatic herbs and resins. The wrapping of the body in clean linen cloth created a ritual boundary between the corpse and the earth, protecting the deceased from direct contact with the dust that would become their eternal sustenance. The quality and quantity of wrapping materials corresponded to the wealth and status of the deceased, with royal burials employing multiple layers of fine linen, while common burials might use only coarse wool or reed matting. Regardless of quality, however, the presence of some form of wrapping was considered essential for proper burial, with texts indicating that unwrapped corpses faced particular difficulties in the underworld. The provisions placed in the coffin alongside the body included ceramic vessels containing water and beer, baskets or bowls of bread and grain, and sometimes meat, fish, or dates for wealthier burials. These provisions were intended to sustain the deceased during the journey to the underworld and to provide initial offerings upon arrival in Irkalla, demonstrating to Ereshkigal and the Anunnaki Judges that the deceased came from a family that had fulfilled their ritual obligations. The types and quantities of provisions were sometimes specified in written instructions left by the deceased before death, revealing careful planning for the afterlife journey. The 7 days of ritual mourning that followed burial involved family members and professional mourners performing prescribed actions that demonstrated grief and fulfilled obligations to the dead. These actions included abstaining from bathing and grooming, wearing torn or soiled garments, sitting in dust or ashes, and publicly lamenting the loss. The funeral banquet held on the 7th day marked the transition from acute mourning to ongoing ancestor veneration, with portions of the feast offered to the deceased through libation pipes or at the tomb entrance. Those who died without proper burial faced a particularly terrible fate in Sumerian belief. Condemned to wander as restless ghosts who could find no peace in Irkalla and often returned to torment the living, exorcism texts from the library of Ashurbanipal, though written in Akkadian, preserve earlier Sumerian traditions regarding these wandering spirits, describing them as consumed by hunger and thirst, unable to enter the underworld proper because they lacked the ritual provisions necessary for the journey. Tablet K 2891 categorizes different types of unquiet dead, including those who died in the wilderness and were consumed by animals, those who drowned and were never recovered, those killed in battle whose bodies were left unburied, and those whose families were too poor to afford proper funeral rites. The unburied dead existed in a liminal state between the living world and the underworld, unable to complete the journey to Irkalla because they lacked the ritual preparation and provisions that would allow Netti to admit them through the gates. Without proper washing and anointing, their pollution prevented them from approaching the gates of death. Without wrapping in clean cloth, they had no protection from the dust of the underworld. Without provisions of food and drink, they could not sustain themselves during the descent through the 7 gates or make appropriate offerings to Ereshkigal and the Anunnaki Judges upon arrival. This exclusion from the normal community of the dead created profound suffering for these wandering spirits. Incantation texts describe them as perpetually hungry and thirsty, seeking sustenance from the living world but unable to consume normal food and drink. Instead, they fed on refuse and filth, drank from stagnant pools and sewers, and haunted the boundaries of human settlements, hoping to receive offerings that their families had failed to provide. The physical manifestations of these ghosts, as preserved in exorcism rituals, included emaciated forms, hollow eyes, gaping mouths, and grasping hands that reached out desperately toward the living. The different categories of unburied dead each presented specific dangers to the living and required distinct ritual responses. Those who died in the wilderness and were consumed by wild animals had been scattered across the landscape with no possibility of recovery or burial. Their dispersed remains prevented proper ritual treatment, and their ghosts wandered seeking the wholeness they had lost. Tablet K6174 describes protective rituals designed to prevent these wilderness ghosts from following travellers home, including the scattering of salt and the recitation of binding spells at crossroads and boundary stones. Those who drowned in rivers or the sea presented particular problems because their bodies often remained unrecovered, swept away by currents to unknown locations where they could not receive proper burial. The Euphrates and Tigris, which brought life to Mesopotamia through their annual floods, also claimed victims who fell from boats, were caught in sudden currents, or were swept away during flood events. The ghosts of the drowned were believed to lurk near water sources, attempting to drag living persons into the water to serve as substitutes who could take their place and allow them finally to enter the underworld. Protective amulets found in archaeological context include inscriptions specifically guarding against the ghosts of drowned persons. Warriors killed in battle whose bodies were left on the field presented both practical and spiritual problems for Sumerian society. When military campaigns ended in defeat, or when battlefields were too dangerous to access for body recovery, fallen soldiers remained unburied and their ghosts became wandering spirits. These military ghosts were considered particularly dangerous because they retained the violent impulses that had characterized their final moments of life and often attacked the living in rage and frustration. Royal inscriptions from multiple periods describe military campaigns undertaken specifically to recover bodies of fallen soldiers from previous battles, demonstrating the importance placed on ensuring proper burial even years after death. The category of those whose families were too poor to afford proper funeral rites reveals the economic dimensions of Sumerian death practices and the social inequalities that persisted even in matters of burial. While the minimum requirements for proper burial were not extraordinarily expensive, consisting of basic washing, simple wrapping, a ceramic coffin or reed mat, and minimal provisions, even these modest costs exceeded the means of the poorest members of society. Charitable burial provisions existed at some temples, where priests would perform minimal rites for the destitute, but many poor persons died without access to even these basic services. The wandering of unburied ghosts created ongoing dangers for the living, as these desperate spirits sought to satisfy their hunger and thirst through supernatural means that often harmed living persons. Medical texts attribute various diseases and afflictions to the attacks of unquiet ghosts, including wasting sickness, fever, nightmare, and madness. The ghost of one who died of thirst was believed to cause drought in crops and livestock, while the ghost of one who died of hunger would steal food from granaries and cause famine. The ghost of a murdered person who remained unavenged would not rest until their killer had been identified and punished, haunting the living until justice was achieved. Protective rituals designed to ward off unburied ghosts involve creating barriers both physical and supernatural around dwellings and sacred spaces. Archaeological evidence from residential areas at and other Sumerian cities reveals the burial of foundation deposits containing protective amulets, clay figurines of guardian spirits, and inscribed tablets with binding spells designed to prevent ghosts from crossing thresholds. These deposits were placed at doorways, in corners of rooms, and beneath floor levels, creating networks of protection throughout domestic spaces. The living maintained connections with their deceased ancestors through regular offerings of food and drink poured into offering pipes that extended from tombs into the ground, theoretically reaching down to Irkalla where the dead resided. Archaeological excavations at the Royal Cemetery of revealed elaborate tomb structures incorporating these offering systems, including drainage channels and collection basins designed to deliver libations to burial chambers. Sir Leonard Woolley's excavations between 1922 and 1934 uncovered evidence of regular offerings, continuing for decades or even centuries after burial, with successive layers of pottery vessels stacked in offering shafts demonstrating persistent ancestor veneration. The offering pipes, typically constructed from ceramic tubes or hollowed reeds, created physical connections between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. These pipes extended from ground level down through layers of earth and brick to terminate in or near the burial chamber, allowing liquids poured at the surface to flow down to the deceased. The engineering of these systems required careful calculation of slopes and drainage to ensure that offerings would reach their intended destination rather than pooling in the soil or flowing away from the tomb. The types of offerings varied according to the wealth of the family and the status of the deceased, but typically included water, beer, milk, honey, and sometimes wine for the most elaborate rituals. These liquids were poured into the offering pipe while reciting prayers that identified the deceased by name and relationship, requesting that they accept the offering and refrain from returning to trouble the living. The prayers preserved in ritual text emphasize reciprocal obligations between the living and the dead, with family members providing sustenance in exchange for the deceased's benevolent oversight and protection of their descendants. The frequency of offerings followed calendars determined by kinship obligations and ritual requirements. Immediate family members were expected to provide daily offerings during the initial mourning period, weekly offerings during the first year after death, and monthly offerings thereafter. Special occasions, including the anniversary of death, major festivals, and family celebrations required additional offerings. The cumulative burden of these obligations across multiple generations of deceased ancestors could consume substantial household resources, particularly for families with many dead relatives requiring veneration. Archaeological evidence demonstrates that these offering practices were not merely symbolic, but involved actual delivery of substantial quantities of liquids to burial areas. Excavations at uncovered offering shafts filled with broken pottery vessels, the accumulated debris of centuries of libation rituals. Chemical analysis of residues in these vessels and in the soil surrounding tombs has confirmed the presence of organic compounds consistent with beer, milk, and other offerings mentioned in ritual texts. The quantities of material involved suggest that families took their obligations to the dead seriously and devoted significant resources to maintaining these connections. The theological framework supporting ancestor veneration held that the dead in Irkalla, though reduced to shadowy existence, retained consciousness and some capacity to influence events in the living world. Well-fed ancestors who received regular offerings would protect their descendants from harm, provide warnings of danger through dreams, and intercede with the gods on behalf of their living family members. Conversely, neglected ancestors who received insufficient offerings would grow angry and resentful, returning as malevolent ghosts to afflict their descendants with disease and misfortune until proper veneration was restored. The social implications of these beliefs created strong incentives for maintaining family continuity and ensuring that descendants would continue offering practices after one's death. The Sumerian emphasis on producing male heirs related partly to concerns about ancestor veneration, as sons were considered the primary obligators for maintaining offerings to deceased parents and grandparents. Legal texts from all periods include provisions for ensuring that adopted sons or designated heirs would continue funerary obligations, demonstrating the importance placed on securing ongoing veneration. The royal cemetery of provided dramatic evidence of a practice unique in Mesopotamian history, the burial of dozens of retainers alongside high-status individuals to serve them in the afterlife. Death Pit PG 1663, excavated by Woolley's team, contained the remains of Queen Puabi along with 74 attendants, including soldiers, musicians and servants, all apparently killed and buried simultaneously. The careful arrangement of the bodies, with each individual positioned at their appointed station and wearing their ceremonial garments, suggests they entered the tomb while alive and consumed poison, or were suffocated when the chamber was sealed. The excavation of these mass burial pits shocked the archaeological world when Woolley announced his discoveries in the 1920s, revealing a practice of human sacrifice on a scale unprecedented in Mesopotamian archaeology. The death pits at date the early dynastic period, approximately 2600 to 2400 BC, representing a relatively brief window in Sumerian history, when this extreme form of mortuary practice was employed. No evidence for similar mass burials exists from earlier or later periods, suggesting that the practice was limited to specific royal dynasties at during this particular era. The physical evidence reveals the systematic nature of these ritual deaths. In Death Pit PG 1663, the bodies of attendants were arranged in rows, each person positioned at their designated station as if performing their duties. Musicians held their lyres and harps, soldiers wore their helmets and carried their weapons, serving women stood near vessels and implements of their trade. The positioning suggests that these individuals entered the tomb in procession, took their assigned places, and died while maintaining their posts. The absence of signs of struggle or violence indicates that death came relatively peacefully, most likely through poison administered in a ceremonial drink. The tomb of Queen Puabi herself, at the centre of the death pit, contained the richest assemblage of grave goods ever recovered from ancient Mesopotamia. Her body was adorned with an elaborate headdress of gold, lapis lazuli, and carnelian, multiple necklaces and bracelets of precious materials, and rings on every finger. The burial chamber contained furniture, vessels, musical instruments, and luxury goods that would equip her for continued royal existence in the underworld. The contrast between her lavish burial and the simpler interments of her attendants emphasized hierarchical relationships that would persist in the afterlife. The question of whether these attendants went willingly to their deaths or were forced into the tomb remains unresolved, though the careful positioning and peaceful circumstances suggest some level of cooperation or acceptance. Woolley himself believed that the attendants considered it an honour to accompany their queen or king to the afterlife, viewing their sacrifice as ensuring their own elevated status in the underworld, rather than facing uncertain fate as common dead. Alternative interpretations suggest that social pressure, religious indoctrination, or drugs administered before the final ceremony might have ensured compliance without requiring explicit force. The motivation for these elaborate death rituals relates to Sumerian beliefs about the persistence of earthly hierarchies in the underworld. If kings and queens continued to rule in Irkalla as they had in life, they would require courts and attendants to maintain their royal status. The simultaneous burial of retainers ensured that these rulers would arrive in the underworld, accompanied by their households, ready to establish their courts in Ereshkigal's realm. The practice represented an extreme interpretation of the principle that afterlife conditions depended on burial circumstances, rather than an abandonment of the egalitarian vision of death that characterized most Sumerian thought. The myth of Inanna's descent to and return from the underworld represents the only successful escape from Irkalla recorded in Sumerian literature, an achievement made possible only by her divine nature and through the sacrifice of a substitute. Tablets CBS 1966 from the University of Pennsylvania preserves the conclusion of this myth, where Inanna, having been killed by the Anunnaki judges and hung as a corpse on a hook in Ereshkigal's throne room for 3 days and 3 nights, was resurrected through the intervention of Enki, god of wisdom. However, the laws of Irkalla demanded that someone must take her place, and 7 gala demons accompanied her back to the world of the living to seize her substitute. The narrative of Inanna's resurrection emphasizes that escape from death required external intervention and came at the cost of another's life. Inanna herself could not simply walk back through the 7 gates, as the laws of Irkalla absolutely prohibited voluntary return of the dead to the living world. Instead, Enki, who had not been party to the decisions that led to her death, crafted 2 beings from the dirt beneath his fingernails, creatures neither fully alive nor dead who could enter the underworld without becoming trapped there. He sent these beings, the Kurgara and the Galatur, to Ereshkigal, with instructions to offer sympathy for her suffering and request Inanna's corpse as a gift. The success of this plan depended on exploiting Ereshkigal's isolation and emotional deprivation. When the Kagara and Galatur encountered the Queen of the Underworld in the midst of painful childbirth, they offered the sympathy and compassion she had never received from other gods. Moved by their kindness, Ereshkigal granted their request for Inanna's corpse, allowing them to sprinkle it with the water of life and the food of life that Enki had provided. These magical substances restored Inanna to life, but the fundamental law of the underworld remained inviolable. No one who had entered could leave unless someone else took their place. The 7 Gala demons assigned to accompany Inanna back to the living world served as enforcers of this cosmic law, ensuring that a substitute would be found and dragged to Irkalla to maintain the balance between life and death. As Inanna ascended through the 7 gates, the items of her regalia were returned at each level, restoring her divine power and status as she approached the surface. The Gala followed her closely, immune to her divine authority and focused solely on their mission to seize a replacement. When Inanna returned to the world of the living, accompanied by the Gala demons seeking a substitute to take her place in the underworld, she found her husband Damuzi, the shepherd god, sitting on her throne, in fine garments rather than mourning her death. Enraged by his apparent indifference to her suffering, she fixed upon him the eye of death and decreed that he would take her place in Irkalla. Tablet H.S. 1414 from the Hilprecht collection describes Damuzi's desperate flight from the Gala demons, calling upon the sun god Utu to transform him so he could hide, but ultimately being captured and dragged to the underworld. The contrast between Damuzi's behaviour and that of other figures Inanna encountered during her return journey emphasises the offence that led to his condemnation. At each city she passed through, the local deities and human servants prostrated themselves in mourning, wearing sackcloth and sitting in dust to demonstrate their grief at her death and joy at her return. Damuzi alone had not mourned. Instead, assuming royal authority in her absence and continuing his comfortable existence as if nothing had changed. This violation of expected mourning protocols provided Inanna with justification for selecting him as the substitute the underworld demanded. Damuzi's flight from the Gala demons created a chase narrative that appears across multiple tablets and versions, with the shepherd god calling upon his divine relatives for assistance and attempting various transformations to evade capture. He first appealed to Utu, the sun god, and his brother-in-law, requesting transformation into a gazelle to escape through speed and agility. Utu granted this transformation, and Damuzi fled across the steppe in gazelle form, the Gala pursuing relentlessly behind him. When they drew close, he called upon Utu again for another transformation, this time becoming a small creature that could hide in burrows and crevices. The chase led to the house of Damuzi's sister Geshtinanna, where he sought refuge and concealment. The Gala demons, frustrated in their pursuit, tortured Geshtinanna to force her to reveal her brother's location. The descriptions of this torture in the tablets include beating her, threatening her with death, and promising her rewards for betrayal, but Geshtinanna remained loyal and refused to reveal Damuzi's hiding place. Her steadfast protection of her brother contrasts sharply with Damuzi's failure to mourn for Inanna, establishing Geshtinanna as a model of proper familial devotion. Eventually, however, Damuzi's hiding place was revealed through the treachery of a false friend, and the Gala demons seized him and prepared to drag him to the underworld. The physical description of this capture emphasizes its violence and finality, with the demons binding Damuzi's hands and feet, stripping away his fine garments, and marching him toward the gates of Irkalla. The shepherd god's desperate pleas and attempts to resist proved futile against the implacable Gala, who served the laws of death without mercy or compromise. The compromise that resolved Damuzi's permanent imprisonment in Irkalla established the pattern of seasonal death and rebirth that became central to later Mesopotamian religion. Damuzi's sister Geshtinanna volunteered to take his place in the underworld for half of each year, allowing him to return to the surface for the remaining 6 months. This arrangement, described in Tablet UM 29-15-847, created the alternation between the fertile growing season when Damuzi dwelt among the living, and the hot dry summer when he descended to the land of the dead, leaving the earth barren in his absence. The negotiation that produced this compromise involved appeals to divine justice and family loyalty that moved Ereshkigal to accept a shared substitution rather than insisting on Damuzi's permanent residence in the underworld. Inanna's loyalty to her brother, demonstrated through her refusal to reveal his hiding place despite torture by the gallu demons, established her worthiness to serve as an acceptable substitute. The tablet preserves Ereshkigal's decree that Damuzi would spend 6 months of each year in Irkalla, while Inanna took his place among the living. Then the siblings would exchange positions for the remaining 6 months, creating an eternal cycle of descent and return. The agricultural implications of this seasonal exchange became central to Mesopotamian religious calendar and ritual practice. Damuzi, as a shepherd god associated with fertility and abundance, brought life and growth to the land during his time among the living. The spring months when Damuzi returned from the underworld coincided with the growing season when barley and wheat sprouted, livestock bore young, and the date palms produced fruit. His presence in the upper world manifested physically through the greening of fields and the abundance of flocks, making the connection between divine presence and earthly fertility explicit and observable. Conversely, Damuzi's descent to the underworld each summer corresponded with the intense heat and drought that characterized the Mesopotamian climate from June through September. During these months, rivers ran low, vegetation withered, and the landscape turned brown and barren. The Sumerians understood this seasonal death of the land as directly resulting from Damuzi's absence, his descent to Irkalla literally draining life and moisture from the earth above. The return of fertility in autumn, when irrigation became possible again and new crops could be planted, marked Damuzi's emergence from the underworld to begin another 6-month cycle among the living. Ritual practices developed around this seasonal cycle, with annual ceremonies marking both Damuzi's descent and his return. The descent rituals, performed at the onset of summer, involved communal mourning ceremonies where participants wore torn clothing, sat in dust and ashes, and performed ritual lamentations for the departing god. These ceremonies acknowledged the reality of seasonal hardship while expressing hope for Damuzi's eventual return. Temple complexes at Uruk and other cities maintained professional mourners who specialized in the performance of Damuzi lamentations, preserving traditional songs and gestures that had been handed down through generations. The return rituals, celebrated in early spring, took the form of sacred marriage ceremonies where the king of the city-state enacted the role of Damuzi, while a high priestess represented Inanna. These ritual marriages symbolically restored fertility to the land through the reunion of the divine couple, with the physical union of their human representatives believed to activate cosmic forces that would ensure successful crops and abundant livestock. The sacred marriage ritual became one of the most important ceremonies in the Mesopotamian religious calendar, involving elaborate preparations, costly offerings, and participation by the entire community. The theological implications of the Damuzi cycle extended beyond agricultural concerns to touch fundamental questions about the relationship between life and death, permanence and change, loss and renewal. Unlike the uncompromising vision of death as permanent and inescapable that characterized most Sumerian afterlife beliefs, the Damuzi myth introduced the possibility of periodic return, of movement between the realm of the dead and the world of the living according to established cosmic patterns. This cyclical understanding of death and rebirth influenced later Mesopotamian religious development and eventually contributed to concepts of resurrection and renewal that would appear in other Near Eastern religious traditions. The mathematical precision of the 6-month division reflects Sumerian astronomical knowledge and calendrical calculation. The Sumerian year consisted of 12 lunar months totaling approximately 354 days, requiring periodic adjustment to maintain alignment with the solar year and agricultural seasons. The division of this year into 2 equal halves of 6 months each created a symmetrical pattern that could be easily tracked and ritualized, with the transition points marked by specific astronomical observations, including the positions of stars and the phases of the moon. The Epic of Gilgamesh provides the most detailed description of the underworld from the perspective of a mortal soul, through Enkidu's prophetic dream shortly before his death. Tablet 7 of the standard Babylonian version, preserved in the library of Ashurbanipal, describes how Enkidu saw himself transformed into a bird-like creature and led through darkness to the house where dwell the dead, the house from which none who enter ever returns. He witnessed kings who had ruled all the lands now serving food at tables, high priests and priestesses covered in dust, and divine attendants carrying jugs of water to refresh the dead. The dream vision came to Enkidu during his final illness, a divine curse imposed by the gods as punishment for killing Humbaba, guardian of the cedar forest and the bull of heaven. As fever consumed his body and death approached, Enkidu experienced a prophetic revelation of his destination in Irkalla, seeing with supernatural clarity the realm that awaited him. The vividness and specificity of this vision, preserved in remarkable poetic detail in the epic, suggests it represented a common Sumerian conceptual framework for understanding the death process and the nature of the underworld. The transformation into a bird-like creature that Enkidu experienced marked the fundamental change from living human to shade of the dead. His arms became covered with feathers, his body lightened and became insubstantial, and he developed the ability to move in ways impossible for solid flesh. This metamorphosis represented not merely a poetic image, but a literal description of what Sumerians believed happened to human souls at death. A physical transformation that prepared them for existence in the dusty, dark confines of Irkalla, where normal human bodies could not function. The guide who led Enkidu through the darkness bore characteristics that identified him as a death demon, possibly one of the gallu, or a similar class of underworld servant. The text describes this being as having dark features, a lion's face, and eagle's talons, combining human and animal attributes in ways that marked him as supernatural. His function as psychopomp, a guide of souls to the afterlife, paralleled roles found in other ancient Near Eastern cultures, though the Sumerian version emphasized compulsion rather than gentle guidance, with the demon seizing Enkidu and dragging him toward the gates of death. The architectural description of the underworld as the house where dwell the dead, the house from which none who enter ever returns, emphasized its character as an enclosed space with definite boundaries and structure, rather than an infinite void or formless chaos. The repetition of the word house reinforced the parallel between earthly dwellings and the abodes of the dead, suggesting that Irkalla constituted a dark mirror of the cities above ground, with similar spatial organization but inverse conditions. The absolute prohibition on return, stated as a fundamental characteristic of this house, established the finality of death and the permanence of the barrier between living and dead. The reversal of earthly hierarchies that Enkidu witnessed in his vision provided some of the most powerful imagery in the entire epic. Kings who had worn crowns of gold and ruled vast territories now served as waiters, carrying food and drink to other dead souls. High priests and priestesses who had mediated between humans and gods, wearing pure white linen and performing sacred rites in gleaming temples, now sat covered in dust, their rituals reduced to shadow performances in dark shrines. Warriors who had commanded armies and won great victories now stood idle, their weapons useless in a realm where there were no enemies to fight and no battles to win. The divine attendants who carried water to refresh the dead represented a small mercy within the general bleakness of Irkalla's conditions, while the standard fare of clay and muddy water characterized the normal diet of the dead. These divine servants provided slightly better sustenance to souls of high status, or those who received generous offerings from their living descendants. The hierarchical gradations within the underworld, though minor compared to earthly distinctions, created variations in the degree of suffering experienced by different categories of dead. The entire narrative arc of the Epic of Gilgamesh revolves around the king's desperate attempt to avoid the fate of all mortals in the land of no return, a quest that ultimately fails but illuminates Sumerian attitudes towards death's inevitability. After witnessing Enkidu's death and 7-day decay, Gilgamesh refused to accept his own mortality and embarked on a journey to find Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who had been granted immortal life by the gods. His journey took him beyond the boundaries of the known world, through the garden of the gods, across the waters of death, to the distant shore where Utnapishtim dwelt, all in hope of learning the secret of eternal life. The death of Enkidu served as the catalyst that transformed Gilgamesh from an arrogant king concerned only with glory and pleasure into a desperate seeker after immortality. The epic describes how Gilgamesh sat beside his friend's body for 7 days and 7 nights, refusing to believe that death had truly claimed Enkidu, until maggots began to emerge from the corpse. This forced confrontation with the physical reality of death and decay shattered Gilgamesh's sense of invulnerability and made him acutely aware of his own mortality. The 7 days of mourning parallel the standard Sumerian funeral customs, but Gilgamesh's refusal to complete the burial represented his inability to accept death's finality. The psychological transformation that occurred during this vigil drove Gilgamesh to abandon his kingdom and wander the wilderness in animal skins, consumed by fear of his own inevitable death. Tablet 9 describes how he roamed the steppe weeping, asking all he encountered whether he too must die like Enkidu and lie down in the earth never to rise again. This existential terror, so viscerally portrayed in the epic, reflected profound Sumerian anxieties about death and the bleak afterlife that awaited all mortals regardless of their achievements during life. The decision to seek Utnapishtim represented Gilgamesh's attempt to find a practical solution to the problem of mortality, rather than accepting philosophical consolations or religious faith. He reasoned that if one mortal had escaped death and gained eternal life, then the method must exist and could potentially be replicated. The fact that Utnapishtim lived at the ends of the earth, in a realm beyond normal human access, only made the quest more difficult. Not impossible. Gilgamesh's determination to overcome any obstacle in pursuit of immortality demonstrated the intensity of his death anxiety and his refusal to accept conventional wisdom about mortality's universality. The journey itself tested Gilgamesh through a series of increasingly challenging trials that pushed the limits of human endurance and capability. He first travelled to the mountain of Mashu, where the sun rose each morning. Guarded by scorpion beings whose appearance could kill ordinary mortals with fear, these guardians initially challenged his right to pass, but recognizing his partial divine heritage and his desperate determination, they allowed him to enter the tunnel through the mountain. This passage through 12 double hours of utter darkness, a journey the sun made each night, represented a symbolic death and rebirth that prepared Gilgamesh for his encounter with the realm beyond normal mortal experience. Emerging from the mountain tunnel, Gilgamesh entered the garden of the gods, where trees bore jewels as fruit and precious stones lay scattered on the ground like pebbles. This supernatural realm existing at the edge of the world demonstrated that he had passed beyond the ordinary boundaries of human geography into cosmic space where normal rules no longer applied. Here he encountered Siduri, the divine alewife who dwelt at the edge of the sea, who questioned why he pursued immortality rather than accepting his mortality and enjoying the simple pleasures of life. Her advice, preserved in Tablet 10, represented the conventional Sumerian wisdom regarding death. Accept its inevitability and focus on enjoying earthly existence while it lasted. Gilgamesh rejected this wisdom and pressed on, convincing Siduri to direct him to Ushanabi, the ferryman who could transport him across the waters of death to reach Utnapishtim's distant dwelling. The waters of death, described as deadly to the touch, required special navigation techniques using punting poles that could be discarded after each push, rather than allowing the toxic water to touch the ferryman's hands. The crossing itself represented the final barrier between the world of the living and the realm where Utnapishtim dwelt, a one-way passage that normally only the dead could make. Utnapishtim revealed to Gilgamesh the location of a plant growing at the bottom of the cosmic ocean that could restore youth and vitality, offering a form of immortality through continuous renewal. Tablet 11 of the epic describes how Gilgamesh tied heavy stones to his feet and descended to the ocean floor, grasping the plant despite its thorns that cut his hands. He intended to bring it back to Uruk, test it on an old man to verify its properties, then consume it himself to regain his youth. However, while Gilgamesh bathed in a cool pool during his return journey, a serpent smelled the plant's fragrance, emerged from the water, and consumed it, shedding its skin and gaining the power of renewal. The plant of rejuvenation represented a compromise between full immortality, which remained impossible for mortals, and the universal fate of death that Gilgamesh sought to escape. Rather than preventing death entirely, the plant offered the possibility of continuous youth, allowing its possessor to return repeatedly to youthful vigour as age approached. This renewal through plant consumption paralleled actual Mesopotamian medical practices that used herbs and botanical preparations to treat age-related ailments and maintain vitality, though obviously no actual plant possessed the miraculous properties described in the epic. The name of the plant, preserved in the Akkadian version as the old man becomes young again, explicitly stated its function and appeal. The thorny nature of the plant added an element of difficulty and danger to its acquisition, suggesting that rejuvenation required effort and sacrifice rather than coming easily. The location at the bottom of the cosmic ocean placed it in the realm of Enki, god of wisdom and fresh water, whose domain included knowledge of healing and life-giving substances. Gilgamesh's success in obtaining the plant demonstrated that determination and heroic effort could achieve what seemed impossible, that a mortal could acquire substances or knowledge normally reserved for divine beings. His plan to test the plant on an elderly man before consuming it himself showed practical wisdom. A caution born from his long quest and the many deceptions he had encountered. The intention to bring the plant back to Uruk and share its benefits with his people elevated his quest from purely personal fear of death to concern for his community's welfare. The loss of the plant to the serpent represented the cruelest reversal in the entire epic, snatching away the solution to mortality just when it seemed secured. The circumstances of the loss emphasized the arbitrary and almost casual nature of the theft. Gilgamesh had not been careless or foolish. He had simply stopped to bathe and refresh himself in a cool pool, a moment of normal human pleasure after his long journey. The serpent's theft occurred in that moment of inattention, suggesting that mortality could not ultimately be escaped through any amount of effort or wisdom, that death would find ways to reassert its dominion even over those who seemed to have defeated it. The serpent's acquisition of the plant's power manifested through its ability to shed its skin and renew itself, explained a natural phenomenon through mythological narrative while simultaneously emphasizing the transfer of immortality from human aspiration to natural cycle. Snakes do shed their skins periodically, emerging apparently renewed and rejuvenated, a biological fact that seemed miraculous to ancient observers. The myth provided an etiological explanation for this phenomenon, while also driving home the lesson that humans cannot escape death, while even serpents possess powers of renewal. Utnapishtim, known in Sumerian traditions as Ziusudra, represented the single exception to death's universal dominion. Granted immortality by the gods after preserving humanity and all living creatures during the Great Flood. Tablet CBS 10673 from Nippur preserves the Sumerian flood account, describing how Ziusudra, warned by the god Enki of the coming deluge, constructed a massive boat according to precise specifications and loaded it with representatives of all species. After the flood waters receded and he had made proper sacrifices to the gods, Enki and Enlil granted him eternal life and transferred him to Dilmun, the land of the immortals, beyond the reach of death. The exceptional nature of Utnapishtim's immortality emphasized rather than undermined the general rule of human mortality. The circumstances that led to his escape from death were unique and unrepeatable, involving a catastrophic flood that the gods themselves had sworn would never occur again. The gift of eternal life came not as a reward that others might earn through similar service, but as a one-time exception, made necessary by the unprecedented nature of Utnapishtim's achievement in preserving all life through the deluge. When Gilgamesh demanded to know how Utnapishtim had achieved immortality, hoping to replicate his success, the flood hero explained that the circumstances were unique and could never occur again. The assembly of the gods had granted him eternal life specifically because he had preserved all life through the flood, an event the gods themselves had sworn would never be repeated. Tablet 11 states clearly that there would be no second flood, no opportunity for another mortal to earn the same reward, making Utnapishtim's immortality a singular historical occurrence rather than a repeatable path. The conversation between Gilgamesh and Utnapishtim, preserved in remarkable detail in the 11th tablet of the epic, reveals the fundamental impossibility of escaping mortality through any achievable human effort. Utnapishtim began by asking Gilgamesh a pointed question. Who would assemble the gods for him as they had assembled for the flood hero? The rhetorical nature of this question emphasized that divine assembly and decision-making occurred according to cosmic necessity and divine will, not in response to human ambition or desire. No mortal could convene the gods or compel them to grant the gift of eternal life simply by wanting it, or even by performing heroic deeds. The uniqueness of the flood itself made Utnapishtim's situation unrepeatable. The deluge had been decreed by the divine assembly led by Enlil as a solution to the problem of human overpopulation and noise that disturbed the gods' rest. After the flood destroyed nearly all life and the gods realized the catastrophic consequences of their decision, they swore binding oaths that such a total destruction would never be permitted again. These divine oaths, recorded in the flood narrative itself, created cosmic law that even the gods could not violate. With no future flood possible, no future human could perform the service that had earned Utnapishtim his reward. The specific terms of Utnapishtim's immortality grant further distinguished it from any form of eternal life that might theoretically be available to others. The gods had not merely extended his lifespan, or made him immune to disease and aging while remaining on Earth. Instead, they had transported him to Dilmun, a mythological paradise located beyond the normal bounds of the world, where he dwelt in isolation from human society. This exile to a distant land accessible only through supernatural means meant that even if another mortal somehow achieved immortality, they would be removed from the human world just as Utnapishtim had been, making the gift more of a curse than a blessing for someone like Gilgamesh who valued his role as king and connection to his city. The test that Utnapishtim proposed to Gilgamesh further demonstrated the impossibility of human escape from death. He challenged the king to resist sleep, the younger brother of death, for 6 days and 7 nights, arguing that if Gilgamesh could not even conquer sleep, how could he hope to overcome death itself? The test made explicit the connection between sleep and death that permeated ancient Near Eastern thought, with sleep understood as a temporary death, and death as an eternal sleep. Gilgamesh's immediate failure at this test, falling asleep the moment he sat down despite his confident assertion that he would remain wakeful, proved Utnapishtim's point about the inescapable power of death and its related forces over human nature. The series of loaves of bread that Utnapishtim's wife baked and placed beside the sleeping Gilgamesh, one for each day of his slumber, served as physical evidence of his failure when he awakened claiming he had only dozed for a moment. The progressive moulding of the bread from fresh to rock hard demonstrated objectively how long he had actually slept, preventing him from denying or minimizing his failure. This detail emphasized the Sumerian conviction that humans could not escape their fundamental nature, that mortality was woven into the very fabric of human existence, and could not be overcome through will or effort alone. The eventual gift of knowledge about the rejuvenating plant came only after Gilgamesh had fully accepted his failure and prepared to return home in despair. Utnapishtim's wife, moved by compassion for the king who had travelled so far only to face disappointment, urged her husband to give Gilgamesh something to carry home. The plant represented a consolation prize rather than the true immortality Gilgamesh sought, offering the possibility of renewed youth but not escape from eventual death. Even this limited gift was lost through the serpent's theft, driving home the lesson that mortality ultimately could not be cheated or avoided. While the Sumerian underworld was called the land of no return, suggesting permanent separation between the living and the dead, numerous texts describe interactions between ghosts and living humans, indicating that the boundary was not entirely impermeable. Medical and magical texts from all periods of Mesopotamian history include incantations designed to protect against or appease ghosts who returned from Irkalla to afflict the living with disease, nightmares, or misfortune. Tablet K 2843 from Ashurbanipal's library categorizes different types of ghost attacks, including the ghost of one who died young, demanding the life experiences denied by early death, the ghost of one who died violently seeking revenge against the living, and the ghost of one denied proper burial, desperately seeking the offerings that would allow entry to the underworld proper. The permeability of the boundary between living and dead created ongoing concerns for Mesopotamian society and generated extensive ritual literature designed to manage ghost interactions. While the official theology held that the dead remained permanently in Irkalla, practical religious experience recognized that ghosts could and did return to the world of the living under various circumstances. These returns were never presented as violations of cosmic law, but rather as authorized or unavoidable interactions that required careful management through appropriate rituals and offerings. The ghosts of those who died young formed one of the most dangerous categories of returning spirits, because their premature deaths left them with unfulfilled desires and incomplete life experiences. A young woman who died before marriage and childbearing might return to attack pregnant women or newborn children, seeking vicariously to experience the motherhood denied to her. A young man who died before establishing a household and gaining recognition in the community might afflict successful peers with disease or misfortune, expressing the rage and envy of his truncated existence. Protective rituals against these ghosts involved acknowledging their legitimate grievances while establishing boundaries that prevented them from harming the living. Violent death created particularly vengeful and dangerous ghosts whose return to the living world sought recompense for the circumstances of their deaths. Those murdered unavenged would not rest until their killers faced justice, appearing in dreams to identify their murderers or afflicting the guilty with diseases and madness until confession and punishment occurred. Soldiers killed in battle might return seeking the proper burial, and memorial honours denied them when their bodies remained unrecovered on distant battlefields. The ghosts of women who died in childbirth, according to incantation texts, formed an especially feared category because the violence and trauma of their deaths created spirits of particular malevolence toward pregnant women and young children. The unburied dead who lacked the ritual provisions necessary for entering Irkalla proper formed the largest and most troublesome category of wandering ghosts. These spirits existed in the liminal zones between the living world and the underworld, unable to complete their journey to the land of the dead but no longer truly part of the living community. Their desperate hunger and thirst drove them to seek offerings from any source, including theft from living households, contamination of water supplies, and physical attacks on vulnerable individuals. The only permanent solution involved performing belated funerary rituals that would provide the ghost with the provisions needed to complete the journey to Irkalla. The mechanisms by which ghosts afflicted the living involved direct spiritual attack that manifested physically as disease, psychological disturbance, or misfortune. Medical diagnostic texts from the Old Babylonian period through the Neo-Assyrian era consistently attribute various symptoms to ghost attacks, including fever, wasting disease, convulsions, paralysis, and mental disturbance. The diagnostic process involved identifying the type of ghost responsible through analysis of symptoms, circumstances of the affliction, and sometimes through dream interpretation or divination. Once the ghost was identified, appropriate rituals could be performed to appease or expel it. The relationship between ghost attacks and moral obligations created a system of supernatural enforcement for social duties, particularly regarding care for the dead and respect for family members. Adult children who neglected offerings to deceased parents could expect affliction by parental ghosts demanding the attention they deserved. Communities that failed to provide for proper burial of the poor might face epidemic disease sent by the collective angry ghosts of the improperly buried. This system meant that death did not end social relationships, but transformed them into ongoing obligations that required continuous maintenance. The Epic of Gilgamesh includes a unique episode found in Tablet 12 of the Babylonian version, describing a necromantic ritual that allowed communication between the living and the dead. Gilgamesh asked Enkidu's ghost to return from the underworld and describe the conditions there, but the laws of Irkalla prevented voluntary return. Only through Ea's intervention, creating a hole in the earth's surface, could Enkidu's spirit rise up like a wind to speak with his friend. The ghost described the hierarchical conditions in the underworld, where those with many sons rested comfortably, those with one or two sons existed in moderate circumstances, and those without descendants or proper burial suffered greatly. The necromantic episode in Tablet 12 presents significant textual problems that have occupied scholars since its discovery. Unlike the preceding 11 tablets, which form a coherent narrative arc, Tablet 12 appears to be a later addition that contradicts the earlier story by presenting Enkidu as still alive in Uruk when he descends to the underworld to recover objects that Gilgamesh had dropped into Irkalla. Despite these narrative inconsistencies, the tablet preserves important information about Sumerian beliefs regarding communication with the dead and conditions in the underworld that complement and confirm evidence from other sources. The circumstances requiring Enkidu's descent to the underworld involved Gilgamesh's loss of two mysterious objects called the Pukku and the Miku, whose exact nature remains debated by scholars, but which clearly possessed magical properties. When these objects fell into the underworld, Gilgamesh mourned their loss until Enkidu volunteered to descend and retrieve them. Before his descent, Gilgamesh warned Enkidu about the behavior required in the underworld, instructing him not to wear clean clothes, anoint himself with oil, carry weapons, make noise, or show affection to his family, as all these actions would attract unwanted attention from the dead and prevent his return. Enkidu's failure to follow these instructions led to his entrapment in Irkalla, seized by the underworld itself for violating the behavioral codes that protected living visitors. Gilgamesh's desperate attempts to secure his friend's release involved appeals to multiple gods, each of whom refused assistance until finally Ea agreed to help by creating an opening in the earth through which Enkidu's ghost could rise. The terms of this release were strictly limited. Enkidu could return only as a ghost, only temporarily, and only to speak with Gilgamesh about conditions in the underworld. He could not resume his former life or remain permanently among the living. The conversation between Gilgamesh and Enkidu's ghost focused entirely on the hierarchical conditions within Irkalla, with Gilgamesh asking repeatedly about the fates of different categories of dead, and Enkidu providing terse, formulaic responses that created a systematic catalogue of afterlife conditions. The repetitive question and answer structure suggests this section may have originated as a separate wisdom text that was incorporated into the Gilgamesh narrative. The information provided creates the most detailed ranking of afterlife conditions found in any Mesopotamian source. The ghost description established that the number of sons who survived to provide offerings determine the quality of existence in the underworld more than any other factor. The man with 7 sons sits on a throne among the gods and listens to music, enjoying the highest status possible for a mortal in Irkalla. The man with 6 sons lives in somewhat lesser comfort, but still enjoys favourable conditions. The pattern continues downward through smaller numbers of suns, with conditions deteriorating as the number decreases. The man with one son receives minimal offerings and exists in correspondingly reduced circumstances. Those who died without sons or whose sons failed to provide offerings faced the worst conditions in the underworld. The man whose corpse lies in the steppe, unburied and unmourned, finds no rest in Irkalla, his ghost wandering restlessly, rather than settling into even the modest comfort available to properly buried dead with surviving descendants. The man who has no one to care for him eats the scrapings of pots and the scraps of bread thrown into the street, reduced to the most degraded form of existence imaginable to Mesopotamian culture, where proper food and its social context defined human dignity. The physical evidence of Sumerian burial practices recovered through archaeological excavation reveals both confirmation of and deviation from the afterlife beliefs preserved in cuneiform texts. Excavations at cemetery sites throughout southern Mesopotamia, including Kish and Nippur, have uncovered thousands of burials demonstrating consistent patterns of interment that align with textual descriptions of proper funerary procedures. Bodies were typically placed in a flexed position, wrapped in reed mats or cloth, and buried with pottery vessels containing food and drink offerings, ceramic cups for libations, and personal items the deceased might need in the afterlife. The flexed or fetal position used for most Sumerian burials involved placing the body on its side with knees drawn up toward the chest and arms folded across the torso. This position served practical purposes in reducing the size of the grave required, while also carrying symbolic significance that scholars have interpreted in various ways. Some suggest the fetal position represented preparation for rebirth, though this interpretation finds little support in Sumerian texts, which emphasize death's finality. More likely, the position facilitated efficient use of burial space and became traditional through long practice rather than expressing specific theological concepts. The wrapping materials varied according to the wealth and status of the deceased, with reed mats representing the minimum acceptable covering for the poorest burials, while wealthy individuals might be wrapped in multiple layers of textile. Archaeological preservation conditions in Mesopotamia rarely allow survival of organic materials, but impressions in soil and occasional preserved fragments indicate that linen and wool textiles were commonly used. The purpose of wrapping extended beyond ritual requirements to include practical concerns about protecting the body from direct contact with earth and creating a defined boundary between the corpse and its surroundings. Grave goods found in Sumerian burials provide direct material evidence for beliefs about afterlife needs and the continuation of earthly activities in these Underworld. Pottery vessels designed for food and drink appear in nearly every burial regardless of status, confirming textual references to provisions for the deceased. The types of vessels changed over time following developments in ceramic technology and style, but their consistent presence demonstrates the enduring belief that the dead required sustenance. Chemical analysis of residues in some vessels has confirmed they originally contained beer, dates, grain, and other foods mentioned in offering texts. Personal items buried with the deceased included tools of their trade, jewellery and ornaments, weapons for warriors, cylinder seals for administrators, and toys for children. The inclusion of these objects suggests beliefs that individuals would continue their earthly occupations and identities in the afterlife, maintaining the same roles and requiring the same equipment they had used during life. A craftsman buried with his tools could continue practicing his craft in the underworld workshops described in mythological texts. A woman buried with her jewellery and cosmetics would maintain her personal appearance in the shadowy realm of the dead. The arrangement of bodies and grave goods within tombs reveals careful attention to proper positioning and orientation that suggests ritual requirements beyond. Simple disposal of the dead. Bodies typically faced in consistent directions, often eastward toward the rising sun, though the significance of this orientation remains debated. Grave goods were placed in specific locations relative to the body, with food and drink vessels typically near the head, personal items close to the hands, and larger objects at the feet. This standardization across hundreds of burials indicates shared cultural knowledge about proper burial procedures that was maintained over centuries. Elite burials demonstrated the same basic patterns as common graves, but with dramatically increased quantity and quality of grave goods. The royal tombs at Ur contained thousands of objects crafted from gold, silver, lapis lazuli, carnelian, and other precious materials, along with elaborate furniture, musical instruments, and the remains of sacrificed attendants. These extraordinary burials represent the extreme end of a continuum that extended from the simplest pit grave, with minimal provisions, to these spectacular displays of wealth and power. The continuity of basic burial customs across this social spectrum suggests that fundamental beliefs about death and the afterlife were shared by all levels of Sumerian society. Variations in burial practice over time and across different Sumerian city-states reveal regional and chronological developments in death customs while maintaining core elements that persisted throughout Sumerian civilization. Early dynastic burials from around 3000 BC through 2400 BC show the most elaborate grave goods and most consistent adherence to specific burial procedures. The Ur-III period from approximately 2100 to 2000 BC saw some simplification of burial customs while maintaining essential elements. These changes likely reflected economic factors and shifting political circumstances rather than fundamental alterations in afterlife beliefs. The Sumerian vision of the afterlife as a dark, dusty, universally accessible underworld profoundly influenced all subsequent Mesopotamian civilizations, with Akkadian, Babylonian and Assyrian cultures adopting and adapting these concepts while making relatively minor modifications. The Akkadian term for the underworld, Irkalla, derived directly from the Sumerian Irkalla, demonstrating linguistic continuity in death concepts. The Epic of Gilgamesh, though existing in its most complete form in the standard Babylonian version, clearly derived from earlier Sumerian tales and preserved the essential Sumerian vision of death as inescapable and the afterlife as bleak equality. The transmission of Sumerian afterlife concepts into Akkadian and later Mesopotamian cultures occurred through multiple channels, including direct translation of Sumerian texts into Akkadian, incorporation of Sumerian religious traditions into Akkadian cult practice, and the training of scribes in bilingual schools where Sumerian remained the language of scholarship and religion long after it ceased to be spoken in daily life. The continuity of the scribal tradition across political transitions and ethnic changes ensured that core theological concepts, including ideas about death and the underworld, remained remarkably stable, even as surface elements of religion and culture evolved. The major theological developments in later Mesopotamian death concepts involved elaboration and systematization of ideas already present in Sumerian sources rather than fundamental innovations. Babylonian period texts expanded the catalogue of underworld demons and described in greater detail the bureaucratic administration of Irkalla. But these elaborations built upon Sumerian foundations. The increased emphasis on personal piety and individual relationships with protective deities that characterized first millennium BC Mesopotamian religion created some modifications in how people approached death and sought protection from its terrors, but did not alter the basic understanding of the underworld as a place of dust and darkness from which there was no return. The persistence of the Sumerian underworld vision through 3,000 years of Mesopotamian civilization, surviving the fall of Sumerian political power, the rise and fall of multiple empires, and significant changes in language and ethnic composition of the population, testifies to the power and resonance of these concepts. The bleak egalitarianism of death in Irkalla. Sei, where kings and slaves alike became shadows eating clay, apparently struck successive generations as fundamentally true to human experience of mortality. The emphasis on proper burial and ongoing offerings as the only means of improving one's lot in the afterlife created social structures and family obligations that reinforced these beliefs and ensured their transmission across generations. The influence of Mesopotamian underworld concepts extended beyond the geographical bounds of Mesopotamia itself to affect neighbouring cultures including the Hittites, Hurrians, and eventually the Israelites, whose early afterlife concepts show clear Mesopotamian influence. The Hebrew Sheol, described in biblical texts as a place of dust and darkness where the dead exist as shadows, bears unmistakable similarities to the Sumerian Irkalla, despite theological differences between Israelite monotheism and Mesopotamian polytheism. The universal accessibility of Sheol to all the dead regardless of moral conduct parallels the Sumerian vision of death as the great equalizer. The gradual development of alternative afterlife concepts in the ancient Near East, including Egyptian beliefs in judgment and reward or punishment after death, and later Jewish, Christian, and Islamic concepts of paradise and hell, represented departures from, rather than developments of the Sumerian tradition. These alternative visions offered hope for justice beyond death, and the possibility of eternal reward for virtue, directly contradicting the bleak Sumerian insistence that death brought only dusty equality, regardless of earthly conduct or achievement. The persistence of both traditions, the hopeful and the despairing, through subsequent religious developments demonstrates the profound human ambivalence about death and the difficulty of accepting either complete annihilation or simple continuation of earthly inequalities into eternity. The accumulated evidence from cuneiform tablets, archaeological excavations, mythological narratives and burial practices reveals a civilization profoundly shaped by its understanding of death as the ultimate boundary of human existence. The Sumerian vision of Irkalla as a dark, dusty realm beneath the earth, where all the dead dwelt in shadowy equality, regardless of their earthly achievements, represents one of humanity's earlier systematic attempts to conceptualize what happens after death. Unlike later religious traditions that offered hope of paradise for the virtuous or promised reunion with loved ones in a pleasant afterlife, the Sumerians confronted mortality with stark honesty, acknowledging that death reduced all humans to the same diminished state of eating clay and drinking muddy water in perpetual darkness. The consistency of this vision, across multiple independent sources spanning more than 1,000 years of Sumerian civilization, demonstrates that these beliefs represented deeply held cultural convictions rather than the speculations of individual authors or schools of thought. From the earliest references in administrative tablets dating to the early dynastic period through the elaborate mythological narratives of the Ur-3 and Old Babylonian periods, the fundamental characteristics of the underworld remained constant. The 7 gates, the judgment by the Anunnaki based on ritual rather than moral criteria, the role of Ereshkigal as the isolated queen of the dead, and the transformation of human souls into bird-like shadows all appear with remarkable consistency across texts, separated by centuries and originating from different Sumerian city-states. The practical implications of these beliefs shaped Sumerian society in profound ways, creating elaborate systems of ancestor veneration, generating substantial economic activity around funerary practices, and establishing social obligations that bound the living to the dead across generations. The enormous resources devoted to proper burial, ongoing offerings, and maintenance of tomb structures reflected a civilization that took its obligations to the dead as seriously as its responsibilities to the living. The royal cemetery at Ur, with its spectacular grave goods and sacrificed retainers, represents the extreme expression of beliefs that affected every level of society from the wealthiest kings to the poorest farmers. The influence of Sumerian death concepts extended far beyond the geographical and temporal boundaries of Sumerian civilization itself, shaping the afterlife beliefs of all subsequent Mesopotamian cultures and eventually affecting religious traditions throughout the ancient Near East. The direct linguistic continuity from Sumerian Irkalla to Akkadian Irkalla demonstrates the persistence of these concepts even as political power shifted from Sumerian to Akkadian speakers. The Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved in its most complete form in Babylonian versions from the 1st millennium BC, maintained the essential Sumerian vision of death as inescapable, and the afterlife as universally bleak nearly 2,000 years after Sumerian ceased to be a spoken language. For contemporary humanity, the Sumerian confrontation with mortality offers both stark warning and strange comfort. The warning lies in their unflinching recognition that death cannot be escaped through wealth, achievement, or virtue. That the same fate awaits all regardless of earthly status or conduct. Yet there is comfort in their emphasis on the importance of human relationships, the obligations between living and dead that continued beyond the grave, and the possibility of marginally improving conditions in the afterlife through the faithful care of descendants. The Sumerian vision reminds us that our relationship with death shapes how we live, that accepting mortality's inevitability need not lead to despair, but can instead focus our attention on the connections and obligations that give meaning to our limited time in the world of the living. In the land of no return, the Sumerians found not nihilistic hopelessness, but reason to honour the dead, care for family, and maintain the rituals that bound together the communities of the living and the dead across the boundary that all must eventually cross.